And so the title of the talk is Meditation and the Cessation of Consciousness. So I just want to start by saying that before science, before Buddhism, there is reality. And I want to say this because that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in reality. I'm not interested in other people's sort of scientific opinions. I'm also not interested in Buddhism, which is itself not monolithic. There's many different sort of streams of Buddhism and lineages and various other very powerful contemplative traditions. And all of them have a lot to offer, just like our current scientific paradigm has a lot to offer. But really, I'm interested in trying to get behind them. So although I draw on both of these, what we're really trying to do here is kind of understand phenomena as they are. And for that, we need to just inquire in the deepest way possible. And of course, science and meditation, to me, are two very good techniques for inquiring about the nature of reality. So what is cessation? So obviously we have a lot of different cessations of consciousness that we're familiar with, right? So we go under general anesthesia when we have a surgery. Maybe some of us have fainted or been knocked out or something like that. We have a small kind of taste of this in deep sleep as well. And then there's, of course, traumatic brain injuries that can cause us to have a cessation of consciousness, drugs like ketamine or, again, propofol, general anesthesia. Some animals go into torpor or hibernation, which is a deep kind of cessation, you could say, that lasts for long periods of times, often in caves, as it turns out also that meditators, historically like to practice these cessations in the context of a cave. I don't know if that's a coincidence or not. But the question of cessations of consciousness during meditation are unique because unlike those other cessations, this is very intentional. It's something that happens through the process of meditation, and it's something that advanced meditators can willfully induce. For most meditators, it happens sort of spontaneously, but for some very advanced meditators, they can make these cessations of consciousness happen on demand. And so one of the first papers written about this was authored by myself and several other people. And the aim here was to just characterize what these states are, give their Buddhist context, describe the phenomenology, and then try to make sense of it scientifically. And what could it mean given our current understanding of how the mind and brain works. And we also then describe some experiments that were conducted, and I'll go into those in a lot more detail soon. But basically, cessation is the absence of all experience and consciousness with no retrospective awareness of anything having taken place during the absence, accompanied by a subsequent profound sense of clarity, openness, vitality, and compassion. And often meditators report these profound after effects of the cessation, where there's this intense sort of clarity and openness and flexibility, as if one has a kind of new lease on life, as if waking up from the longest dream or longest sleep of your life. And I want to distinguish between two kinds of cessation. One is nirodha, and nirodha is, we can define as a short gap or cut in the stream of consciousness, often followed by a sense of clarity, openness, and compassion. Nirodha cessations are sometimes associated with an important stage of progress in meditation, such as path or fruition. Not always, though. So when these important stages of progress happen in the Buddhist context, then there's a real, the key thing is this transformation, this permanent transformation in how one's mind works and how one perceives themselves and reality. But it's often accompanied by one of these cessations. The other is nirodha samapatti, which is the result of a process where one passes through all these jhanas, these sort of tranquil absorption states, with insight, and creates the conditions for nirodha samapatti to occur, sometimes for a pre-specified amount of time, up to as long as 7 days, which is very interesting. It is said that nirodha samapatti is only available to the most advanced meditators, known as anagamis or arahants, and has the strongest and most profound sort of after effects. So to provide again like a little bit more of this Buddhist context, because I think it's important, because that's where this is explained in such intense detail. So the fading away, cessation of experience is emphasized in Buddhist meditation. So in a what I think is a classic book on meditation by a much loved contemporary teacher, Rob Berbeya, he says, in a moment when clinging, identification, and grasping at inherent existence are pacified, there is the cessation of perception. The phenomena of the six senses do not appear at all. The Buddha stressed the importance of such cessation many times. The Buddha said, that sphere should be understood where the eye ceases and perception of forms fades away, where the ear ceases and the perception of sounds fades away, where the nose and smell, tongue and taste, body and perception of tactile objects fades away. That sphere should be understood where the mind ceases and perception of mental phenomena fades away. The word understood here, I think, is important and does a lot of work. Through letting go of clinging more and more totally and deeply, the world of experience fades and ceases, and seeing and understanding this is of great significance. And the Buddha again said, I say that the end of the world cannot be known, seen, or reached by traveling. Yet, I also say that without reaching the end of the world, there is no making an end to dukkha, or dissatisfaction. Another quite renowned manual on insight by Mahasi Sayadaw says the following, which I very much like. But in the last phase of meditation, instead of falling upon that continuous occurrence, that stream of consciousness, it passes beyond it and alights upon non-occurrence. That is to say, it reaches as if it alights upon cessation, which is the stilling of the formations or conditioned phenomena. And one more. There is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated. If there were not the unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, there would not be the case. It would not be the case that emancipation from the born, become, made, fabricated would be discerned. But precisely because there is an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, emancipation from the born, become, made, fabricated is discerned. It's quite unusual language, I'm sure, for many people listening in, but it does get the point across, I think. And so, as contemplative science, that is the study of meditation by neuroscientists, psychologists, and cognitive scientists, has developed, we've kind of been moving into this new wave of meditation research with an interest in these advanced states. We've had a lot of research into mindfulness and meditation as attention training or emotion regulation. But there's a growing interest, especially amongst a kind of a small group of us, on advanced states of meditation, because we feel that, that's really where the most epistemic insight can be found, is with these advanced states, because they reveal something unusual about the nature of the mind and consciousness that can then inform our understanding of how the mind works. So several studies have been conducted, one by Aviva Berkovich-Hanna, who originally found that fruitions and the cessation associated with fruition led to increasing global long-range gamma activity using EEG. Then came our paper that really went into a lot of depth into nirodha, and for the first time nirodha samapatti, this particularly advanced form of nirodha. And then several other studies by myself and especially out of Matthew Sackett's lab over at the Harvard Meditation Research Program, many studies coming out. And so I want to talk to you now about the first study that we did on nirodha samapatti with a meditator with a background in both yoga and Theravada Buddhism, and thousands of hours of meditation experience and long retreats and so on. And so in this study, we just had the N of 1. And we had two sessions, which were on 2 separate days that we did these recordings. We had, and on session 1, we had three conditions that we repeated. One was the resting state condition, another was a focused attention condition, another is the nirodha samapatti, and then we had rest, nirodha samapatti, and focused attention, again in a slightly different order to try to deal with some order effects there. And then on another day, we had the participant go to sleep for 120 minutes, then have just a resting state for 10 minutes, and then nirodha samapatti for another 110 minutes. And so we took many measurements. We really wanted to get as much information as we could about this state, because it's so unusual, and it's rare to find someone who can do this for such a prolonged period of time and can really time it at a precise level. So we took neural activity using high density EEG. We measured heart rate, respiration, blood oxygen saturation, movement, skin conductance, temperature, and other indicators of nervous system activity as well. So he was, plugged in all the possible ways that you can imagine. So research question 1, does cessation modulate the brain's tendency to generate predictions about the next moment in time? So the idea here is that since the mind is a kind of prediction machine, it's always predicting its experience into reality, and this requires integrating information over time. Does deconstructing the mind all the way down to cessation lead the system to stop making these habitual predictions that actually give rise to all the contents of our mind? So the way that we measured that in this first session is we presented what's called an oddball paradigm. So this is very commonly used in cognitive neuroscience. And in this task, you basically present one tone consistently, like in this case, we're using vowels and deviant vowels, but I can explain it more simply just by giving sound. So for example, it goes beep, 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 boop, beep, beep, and then it just repeats this sort of pattern. And every time you get that deviant sound, that boop, instead of the beep, the brain sort of sees this as a prediction error, right? So it goes beep, beep, beep. The brain starts to make predictions about the next beep, and then it gets a boop, and then it gets this thing called a mismatch negativity, which is basically just the prediction error in the brain that we can very reliably measure. And in our experiment, we had 80% standards, 300 per block, and 20% deviance. And so you always need, of course, more standards than deviance in order to get the deviant, the surprise, the neural surprise. And then what you do is basically you have the standards and the deviance, and you take the standards from the deviance and you get the difference wave. And then you can look at this difference wave. So this is from, averaging electrodes. And so then you can look at differences in this difference wave across the conditions to see how this prediction error response is changing as a consequence of this meditation. So here you have in the green the focused attention condition, in the blue the nirodha samapatti condition, and in the red the resting state condition. And so this is a highly automatic response, and here we didn't find any difference in the prediction error signal. So the brain is not doesn't seem to be so turned off that it's not still making predictions. Now, okay, this actually makes sense, because even in comatose states and vegetative states, you often do find mismatch negativity signaling. So it's in a way, it's reassuring that his brain is not basically dead in this state. We also did a multivariate pattern analysis, which is basically machine learning, a kind of decoding technique to look at the differences. And here you can see that although the decoder struggled more in the nirodha samapatti condition, again, this blue line here, we didn't find a significant difference. Although there is a difference, and you should, it's worth noting that when you have a single participant, you have a limited power to find small effects. So it's these things need to be repeated with more participants. But again, it does suggest that this kind of automatic predictive processing remains intact. So question 1, does cessation modulate the brain's tendency to generate predictions about the next moment in time? Low-level basic habits of pattern recognition or prediction error minimization appear to remain largely intact. So there's some interesting observations if we go to now the second session about non-REM sleep and cessation that I now want to mention. So we observed that there were rolling eye movements typical of REM observed in the EOG, which measures eye activity. There was no consistent markers of deeper states of sleep. The EEG did show signs of drowsiness and sleep onset. Basically, what this suggests to us that he wasn't in a very deep state of sleep in this condition. Upon awakening, the participant reported having slept lightly and experiencing dreams, and noted that having awareness during sleep is quite normal for them. So this is also interesting, the fact that there's a sort of lucidity that is maintained even in sleep that could potentially explain some of the lack of some of the deeper sleep qualities. Now, we also had some interesting observations about cessation. Now, the participant reported being able to specify the length of nirodha samapatti with high accuracy. So we suggested that they return from nirodha samapatti at the 90-minute mark without us prompting them. So we could basically test whether the participant was able to stay in the nirodha samapatti and come out of it spontaneously exactly at the time that he intended to come out, right? And so during the 90-minute nirodha samapatti meditation, there were almost no observable eye movements or body movements, which is very unusual for such a long period of time. The EEG, respiration, oxygen saturation, and heart rate remained remarkably stable and unchanged throughout the entire 90-minute period. Again, quite remarkable. After 90 minutes, the whole group of us noted an increase in heart rate to approximately 105 BPM, a slight increase in oxygen saturation to 94%, and changes in the EEG and EOG signals compared to the previous 90 minutes. So basically, exactly at 90 minutes, we saw the physiology become to be indicative of some movement, some change in the state of mind, which suggests that perhaps he was able to time this very accurately. The participant then spontaneously opened their eyes at 104 minutes. Now, research question 2, does cessation lead to a reduction in spectral power in the EEG? So as we were conducting this study, we found out that Matthew Sackett's lab was also collecting data on cessation around the same time, quite serendipitously. And so we thought it would be interesting to try to see if we can replicate some of the findings. So they had initially found that as one goes into cessation, so here's the pre, there's the cessation, and then post, they found a quite remarkable reduction in power in the alpha band, which is the dominant frequency band in the brain immediately after cessation, or kind of in the transition period of being in cessation and coming out. So we thought, I wonder if we get this also for nirodha samapatti. So in here we, these are the kind of details of how we extracted the different frequency bands. But basically, here's what we found. So we found quite similarly that the alpha band reduced from wakefulness to non-REM sleep to meditation, and especially meditation was significantly different to wakefulness, but you kind of see this kind of gradual reduction in alpha power that was somewhat consistent with the other findings. But with nirodha samapatti, we also see differences in the theta band and in sigma and beta. So we see a kind of more broad frequency band differences in nirodha samapatti, suggesting that it might indeed be like a deeper shutting down even than nirodha, which is a kind of perhaps like a less deep form of cessation. And if we plot the frequency bands right across, so all the way from 0.5 hertz to 47 hertz are super fast frequencies, and then nirodha samapatti is the purple line here, and the orange line is rest, you can see that across many frequency bands, especially theta, alpha, and beta, we see that nirodha samapatti is lower. So you really have this broadband nirodha in power in the brain. And you also see a particular difference in theta between nirodha samapatti and sleep condition. And again, it's of course, important to see that this is different than sleep, that it's something other than just the kind of restful state. And very interestingly, we actually found that in the sleep state, heart rate was lower than in nirodha samapatti. And this is interesting because neural activity is lower in nirodha samapatti, but heartbeat is higher in nirodha samapatti. So this is an interesting kind of dissociation, which suggests that even though cessation is reducing neural activity, it is sort of a physiologically activated state potentially. So the answer to this is yes, nirodha samapatti results in a relatively broadband reduction in spectral power compared to waking, except for very slow and fast frequencies, as well as reductions in theta compared to non-REM sleep. Another question we had, and this is the final question that I'll describe in terms of the detailed data, neural data. Does cessation lead to a breakdown in cortico-cortical communication? So cortico-cortical communication was again measured by Matthew's lab using something called the phase lag index. And basically this measures, if you take, for example, two nodes in the brain and you get kind of activity over time, you can basically test just how synchronous these activation patterns are. Then you can see, in the different states, how synchronous was neural activity. Synchrony is very important so that the brain can kind of make unified models of reality and share information throughout the brain to kind of put all the pieces together to give us this coherent experience of reality. And so this is from the old data, the previous data that we were trying to replicate, where we can see that as you approach cessation, the neural synchronization goes down, kind of peak low synchronization around the cessation event, and then it gradually comes back. So the meditation seems to desynchronize neural activity, leading to this cessation, and then it synchronizes and binds it all back together. We'll come back to this when we talk about theoretical explanations for what's going on with cessation. So as in our data, when we looked at this, we very much found the same thing. So when we compared nirodha samapatti to the resting state condition, we found that PLI, neural synchrony, was lower. We also found that it was lower than the non-REM sleep condition. So basically, neural synchrony in the alpha band was lowest during cessation, followed by sleep, and then rest, very much replicating the other findings, and again, suggesting something going on with this neural desynchronization, and again, reassuring to see that it's different than the sleep condition. So does cessation lead to a breakdown in cortico-cortical communication as measured by phase lag index? Yes, this measure indicates possibly impaired cortico-cortical communication in the alpha band. So we broadly replicate findings from two different meditators from two different labs comparing nirodha and nirodha samapatti, which I think is really important to do, especially when you're using these single subject designs. So this is some new work conducted by Emma Demsar and colleagues on the microphenomenology of cessation. I won't spend a lot of time on this because this could be, again, a whole talk in itself. But microphenomenology is basically this very rigorous interview technique to get at the fine-grained details of experience. So you do these extremely long interviews on these like super short periods of phenomenology, and you repeat it over and over again to try to really understand in like ridiculous details what's going on in your experience, because we skip over so much of our experience in day-to-day life. So in this study, basically, there was 6 90-minute microphenomenology interviews with an advanced meditator. And the meditator in each interview did a cessation meditation within 3 hours before the interview. And then there was a focus on the kind of short periods around cessation, around the entering cessation, and exiting cessation. And these are just sort of seconds, right? And then you have these longer periods in the meditation and the post-cessation. But really the focus was in these moments before and after, which is where all the kind of juicy stuff happens with cessation, right? And so these were categorized as follows based on the like super detailed verbal reports. So the entering cessation phase was talked about as awareness in darkness or boundless space, beginning with bare awareness, then this sinking, sinking sensation, or this sort of like being sucked into a kind of portal, this kind of increasing honing in of attention, then this cessation moment, which is, of course, there's no sense of time, space, anything having happened, and then this emergence of awareness, this sort of pure awareness moment, then this glimmers of light, and then all pervasive light, a rush of energy and joy, and then this sense of total release of any kind of grasping. So there's a few things that I think are just a nice quotes around the moment after cessation that speaks to the nature of consciousness, I think, in a really interesting way. So the immediate experience, the first experience, is the awareness. There's a moment in time where you're aware of the awareness. The awareness is there. Before that, there's nothing there. It's just turning on, a switching on. It's not gradual. It's just there, just total, unchanging, fundamental, static awareness. There's just like a knowing there. I mean, that's the word that I'm using, but it's just like there's a perception of darkness. There's an understanding, not even a recognition. It's a very interesting description, this. It's such a small experience. For a moment, it's perceivable, but it's always there. There's a solidity to it. It's fixed. This is the most basic, fundamental experience, fundamental awareness, because it feels like that it's always been there, that's just the awareness. Everything else that comes after that is just added on top of it. The awareness remains the same as these things come up. Even when I open my eyes and continue on for a few moments after the meditation where everything is hyper clear, that awareness is the same awareness in that beginning moment and all the way up until that point. So I think it's beautiful to hear this from someone who clearly has cessations of awareness, but then they describe how, nevertheless, despite the fact that you can have a cessation in awareness, awareness is important. Awareness is this sense, in some sense, a kind of groundless ground of experience. So I just wanted to say this, is awareness the irreducible ground? And this is, of course, a debate that's like perennial and is like super active, and people are always arguing about this. And I'm sort of an advocate of a kind of middle way, where it is, in a way, irreducible, but it's also groundless. So I said this recently on Twitter or X. Consciousness is both more flimsy, constructed, contextually dependent, and more mysterious, vast, and irreducible than most want to admit. Rarest seems the capacity to hold these facts in tandem. And I'm sure this is something we'll talk about later on. So now to talk about some theoretical explanations, like how the heck is it possible for one to turn themselves off? I mean, it seems like a paradox. How can you from within, in a way, begin to shut down the machinery that gives rise to our conscious experience? It's a fascinating paradox or contradiction that ends up resolving itself when you actually understand the meditation practices, and I think when you understand what might be going on theoretically. So there's two papers I want to talk about. The first is this one published in 2021 that I'm very proud of, and it was the paper kind of core paper I worked on with Helene during our postdoc that kind of laid the groundwork for the experimental work that we've been doing since. It's called From Many to None: Meditation and the Plasticity of the Predictive Mind. I've given hour-long talks on this, but just a brief kind of download. So the predictive mind, this kind of dominant paradigm in cognitive neuroscience, proposes that the brain constructs reality in this hierarchy. So basically, we're constructing every moment of experience, or the brain is constructing it from, the body as well, through also action. It's a highly embodied process, all the way from like raw sensations to and from all the kind of sensory streams into more conceptual categories, and then into thoughts and narratives and so on. And so, for example, when you're listening to the sound of my voice, at the most sort of fine-grained early stages of processing is just pure sound, right? It's pure sound. There's no words. Then there's kind of syllables as you go higher. Then there's kind of words, and then there's sentences. Then at the highest level, you're tracking this whole presentation, and the brain has to do this constantly and track these things over time, and always kind of be in this balance between the present moment and the longer narrative and story of what's happening in one's life. And so we propose in this paper that you can understand a lot about meditation just by thinking of it as deconstructing these layers of the predictive processing hierarchy. And you can categorize this as going from the thinking or narrative self, so our stories about ourselves, down through focusing our attention into the present moment sensory stream into a kind of experiencing self where you're in touch with the sensations in a more raw and direct way. And then you can go deeper and even let go of sensory experience where you start to have this sort of raw subjectivity experience, kind of just pure awareness kind of experience. And then you can even deconstruct that to have these kinds of cessation experience. So kind of going from narrative self to experiencing self to this kind of pure subjectivity to a cessation moment, and then the reawakening to one's life. So by bringing you ever closer to the present moment, meditation deconstructs abstract processing until all layers of our self fall away. And I think this awareness is a kind of the final graspy self that's there. And again, awareness is this sort of extremely irreducible ground to experience, but it seems to also be malleable, as we know from all these different kinds of states that induce unconsciousness, like propofol general anesthesia and, brain traumas and so on. Now, the other paper that is relevant here is our recent work with Shamil that Amir already mentioned, and Carl Friston recently joined us on this paper as well to formalize it, and it's called A Beautiful Loop, an active inference theory of consciousness. I really recommend that you read this if you're interested in these topics. And so in this paper, one of the many things we tackle is the issue of the unified and coherent nature of all experience. So all experiences, again, all the way from the narrative even to the awareness, is this sort of unified, coherent experience. It's sort of put together. It's one experience where all the sensory streams, while there is senses or while there is thoughts, are all kind of in a coherent space where they're bound together. This is often associated with the binding problem. Like, how does the brain work out on all of these modular things in different parts of the brain, and then it all somehow comes together into this unified experience? It's really one of the fundamental mysteries of the mind and in all the mind sciences. So we propose something we call Bayesian binding as a potential solution to this. I won't go into all the details, but it is relevant for cessation. So just to give you an example, so when we put together a face is and you can imagine in a kind of very noisy situation, the data that comes into our eyes, given our rapid eye movements that are constantly happening, and the actual kind of amount of signal in our senses is actually very noisy. The reason that we get sharp experiences and clear experiences is because we have experience, we have expertise, we have priors, we have beliefs. So for example, we have like a high-level abstract representation of a face, one that we would normally draw, for example, if we were generating it ourselves, which is then matched to our sensory input. And it's through this kind of predictive process of top-down, bottom-up dance that we reach this kind of posterior, which is our bound face percept, where the face looks like one holistic object that we kind of understand, recognize, and parse in a very kind of clear and easy way. Now, the same can be true for our whole experience, right? The whole experience is kind of pieced together and bound together in the same sort of way that we bind together smaller things, right? Like we bind together the features of this cup into a single cup, the body into a body, a face into a face, and we kind of make objects that are made up of all these tiny features into a bound object. We do the same with our conscious experience, is what we propose, right? So our whole field of conscious experience is itself like the face, except it's just binding all of the features of our experience together. So we call this Bayesian binding. So as for nirodha samapatti, here's what we propose. Formally, we hypothesize that cessations of awareness occur when the inferential competition of all the sensors putting together a coherent model of reality fails to reach a global coherence due to deconstructive meditation, which steadily accumulates evidence against the coherence of the reality model. This Bayesian unbinding of the reality model includes the recursion signal necessary for pure awareness. In Mahayana Buddhist terms, this reveals the groundlessness, substrate independence, or emptiness, sunyata, of all phenomena, including consciousness and emptiness itself. Under the right conditions, such an insight may be associated with significant changes to cognition, perception, and self-experience. So I want to unpack this a little bit more because a lot of that was quite technical. So we can call this the disintegration hypothesis or the Bayesian unbinding theory of cessation. So insight practices, so meditation practices, deconstruct, differentiate, and unbind fundamental components of awareness. So often in insight meditation, you pay attention to particular parts of your experience and see their kind of emptiness or their impermanence and so on. In Theravada Buddhist practice, one deconstructs the 5 aggregates of clinging: form, feeling, perception, intentions, consciousness, which is meant to make up the whole field of experience. So you go through each core kind of category of experience and you deconstruct them. And we propose that this deconstruction leads to an inferential failure to bind experience into a coherent, unified whole. So basically, the predictive system, through this meditation, gathers evidence against the unification of consciousness. And if you gather evidence against the unification of consciousness, then that inference, that predictive inference, breaks down, and boom, there goes consciousness at the same time. This is evidenced by a breakdown in synchrony in neural activity, as I've described before. And this is also the same finding you get with propofol and ketamine, so other drugs that induce unconsciousness. You get the same sort of breakdown in neural synchrony that I described earlier with cessation. And this breakdown in normal synchronization may indicate an impairment in cortical communication and thus failure to share information crucial for binding together a coherent conscious experience. Now, I'm talking about cessation as if it's one thing, but I just want to make a caveat now, and especially for going forward in this space. There's a recent book that came out that we have a chapter in the book. It's called The Varieties of Nothingness, and there every chapter describes this extraordinary literature about nothingness across all the great spiritual traditions of the world. Like, I mean, every single one. We had this incredible meeting in the Blue Mountains a few years ago on this particular topic, which then turned into this book, The Varieties of Nothingness, where we had scholars and practitioners from all these different traditions come and describe nothingness from the context of these traditions. And it was just fascinating to see how important this idea of nothingness is and how varied it is. And even within the Buddhist tradition, this idea of nothingness or cessation is varied. And there's all kinds of cessation. You can talk about cessation where everything is gone, or you can talk about cessation or degrees of cessation where there is still some awareness, or you can talk about other kinds of cessations where there's this sort of what some people call as this sort of sparkling, magnificent sort of darkness that's kind of impossible to put into words and so on. So it's just a rich thing to explore, and we shouldn't get stuck on imagining that it's one thing. Now, I want to say something about the staggering after effects reported by meditators, because again, the goal is not to just go into cessation. It's not about like disappearing from the world and not existing anymore. It's about the transformative effects. In fact, you're not aiming for cessation in the meditation. You're just doing the practice, and the practice leads to cessation if the insight is sufficiently clear. That's the kind of theory. But what's important is the transformation that can happen as a consequence. So I want to propose this idea of a computational reset. So we propose in the original Neurosamapati paper that one possibility is that cessation leads to a kind of inner reset, reducing one's computational trust in priors that encode deep beliefs about oneself in the world, which have been revealed to be highly vulnerable and volatile in light of cessation. So if you deconstruct all your existing beliefs and understanding about reality, and then you have this cessation, suddenly the system awakens to the kind of impermanent and flimsy, let's say, nature of everything, and the fact that there is no permanent self there, right? And you see that it's all kind of constructed in some way. This could foreseeably explain some of the trait effects often touted by meditators following such experiences. For instance, less grasping. So the organism now expects that things are always changing, so does not resist when things do in fact change. So when you go through like a long meditation process, it's basically like a constant process of discovering where you're stuck, discovering what you're attached to, discovering what's the new amazing thing that you think is it, until everything that you think is it is kind of released, right? And consciousness is one of the final things that you're just sure this must be it, right? And you're just grasping at this idea of consciousness in your own mind. And consciousness turns out to be just nothing as well. So basically, to put it really simply, one deconstructs their mind through insight. A cessation may occur, and you may notice it, you may not. But what's important is that the system does not return in the same way. It returns in some sort of new way, in a better way, in a less graspy way, a more flexible way, a hopefully more compassionate way. And this is what allows the system, through letting go of this grasping and this insights, to have a kind of fresh lease on life. It's like a new stream of consciousness is available. And so just to conclude, for what this all means for me to be researching cessation and thinking about this also as a meditator, to me, cessation teaches us that there is nowhere to stand and nothing to hold on to, not even consciousness. It therefore reveals that there is no place to hide from the totality of our experience. And we can say that when the world, self, and other are seen to be groundless, what is then left but interdependence, this total embeddedness in our lives? And that's all I have to say. And I just want to give one more big thanks to all the people who worked with me on this. And again, a special thanks to Helene, and thank you for listening. I'm happy to take your questions and discuss.